All right. Hi, everybody. Looks like we're ready to go. I'm Chris Martin. I'm a partner at Lindsay, Kenney, and Langley. We're a regional law firm. We've been in business since 1980. We're a full-service law firm. I'm a litigator. I've got with myself two other litigators who deal with employment matters. We're happy to have MNP here. As you know, that lawyers and accountants and accounting firms go hand in hand, dealing with issues that arise. We have a number of presenters today. Tamara Dewar from our Langley office. She's experienced in labor and employment law. She's an interesting woman in that she's practiced in the United States. So she has different jurisdictions and differing views on employment and labor. Jennifer Loeb is a lawyer also in our Langley office. She's a litigator as well. She's got extensive experience with employment matters, and they're going to help you and give you some advice on the COVID-19 and the issues that arise for all of us health-wise, but in particular our employees and what we can do to assist them. We're also lucky to have AJ Beaudry, who's been working with MNP. He's an accountant. He's been working for over 14 years. He has a consulting service practice that includes assisting with these issues. He knows human resources related topics and has a wealth of experience in it. We also have Daniel Cassoon. He's also, I think he's been with MNP for 14 years. They're a national firm. We've worked with them. We enjoy working with them. They not only have the skills of a national firm, but they bring, because of their varied offices, I think there's 22 in British Columbia, a regional outlook and can assist medium-sized and large businesses. We have a few housekeeping matters that we need to deal with. And we have a slide here that will help us. So basically, we're trying to be concise and get this done within an hour. It's a nice day out in Langley here. I know that we want to be precise with what we tell you and hopefully take some questions at the end. We hope that you're using Google Chrome. That's the browser that's best to view the webinar. If you get cut off as the slide says, you can rejoin us using the original webinar link. If you need to ask a question, you can use the chat provision in the bottom right corner and send us the question. And I hopefully will be able to technically read these questions at the end of the presentations and get your inquiries to the presenters. If you don't have if you have questions that aren't addressed, we're all happy. Our information will be at the end of the slides. Any of us can assist you in dealing with issues that don't get addressed in the next hour or so. So from that sort of brief introduction and the technology that we have here, as I'm looking at myself, realizing that I definitely have a face for radio, I'd like to pass it on to Tamara, who's going to present with Jennifer on COVID-related issues from a legal perspective. Tamara?
Thank you so much, Chris. Let's delve into some of the major issues. This presentation is going to look at some of the common issues a lot of people are facing with employees returning to the workplace and what type of safety requirements you're going to need to implement that. But we also want to look at some of the risks associated with failure to return some of these employees, or conversely, some of the employees who have refused to return to the workplace. I'll take a look at the introduction that we have. We're going to address some of the legal considerations that are happening. So first and foremost is I know a lot of the people on the seminar here either have people who are on a temporary layoff and they're expecting them to return shortly, or there's conditions because of the financial impact from COVID that many employers are facing a situation where they will not be able to bring back all the employees back to the company. So similarly, there's some employees that are in situations, and we'll address some of the high-risk employees or employees that have childcare obligations and how we can accommodate them in this manner. So if you take a look at the introduction, what I'm going to address first of all is returning employees to the workplace. This would be either after a temporary layoff or after a leave of absence or illness that is related to COVID. So a lot of companies, because of this pandemic, have had to lay people off. Hopefully we can bring some of these employees back, but that's not always the case due to financial conditions. Now, the Employment Standards Act sets out the duration that someone can give for a temporary layoff. And originally, the layoff could be up to 13 weeks. Because of COVID, we have an extension. So if the temporary layoff with these employees as a result of, and they refer to it in the Act as a COVID-19 emergency, so anything that is related to this pandemic, the layoff provisions were extended to 24 weeks. That extension, however, must end on or before August 30th. In many cases, that's just not feasible for some employees and employers to bring back in that time period. However, last week we received a new announcement and amendment from the BC government. So parties can apply for an extension to this temporary layoff period. That would go past the August 30th, 2020 deadline. Both the employer and the employee apply for this variance or the extension of time, and the deadline for submission of these is very strict. So you must request an extension of time to vary by August 25th, 2020, and it's determined on a case-by-case basis. But one recommendation I do have is to have a definitive date. If you are applying for this extension, have a date certain as to when the parties can return to the workplace. That will assist you in getting the extension. And the Employment Standards Branch has said they would be responding shortly and approve people by August 30th. So that is an arsenal in your toolbox. I would, if it is difficult to bring some of your employees back, I'd highly recommend applying for that extension. The other aspect is employees that have been out of the workplace because of either an illness or a leave of absence related to COVID-19. Now, I want everyone to take a look at the requirements under this COVID-19 related leave because it was an amendment. It provides job protected leave, but it is an unpaid leave of absence. So shortly, I'll break it down. On one is if the employee was diagnosed with COVID-19, of course, there's safety concerns bringing them back, and they obviously have a leave of absence and a right to that. Similarly, in paragraph 2, it's talking about self-isolation or quarantine. Many employees have work going back in the US, back and forth, and there's that 14-week period, and so that has to be taken into consideration. The key ones we're getting questions from our employees are, what about employees that are providing care to a child, which is very tricky even in the summer months. Many of the daycares closed, summer camps closed. So you have employees that have childcare obligations, and you have to deal with that situation and accommodate them to an extent. And then there are also employees who've been directed not to return to work. Perhaps they were in the US for a period of time. Perhaps they were exposed to someone with COVID. And then also similarly, 5 employees who are outside of British Columbia and cannot return to the province because of border and travel restrictions. Those are still in place. You need to consider that when you're addressing who's coming back to the workplace. Again, I want to emphasize that this COVID-19 leave is an unpaid leave of absence. And I think it should be, an extent, something of a last resort. We do want the employees working, but they are entitled to this, and you have to be aware of it. I think the main factor, the most common question we have, and I think one of the attendees has asked this, what about employees with childcare obligations? And they are entitled to this leave. Another consideration I want everyone to consider is, even though we have these leave of absences related to COVID, and we also have the temporary layoff provisions, the Act in British Columbia, the Employment Standards Act, gives you, provides the duration of the temporary layoff period, but it doesn't necessarily provide you with the right to be laying off these employees. And we'll address that in the legal considerations, because many times if it's not set out in the employment contract, or if it's you're not in an area of work that's seasonal or occupational, this could be deemed termination of employment. Also, if you fail to bring back the employees during this window period, during the temporary layoff period, again, there's a risk that this could be deemed termination of employment, and as an employer, you could be exposed to claims for constructive dismissal or termination of the employment relationship. So I'm going to turn it over to Jen. Jennifer's going to address some of the recommendations if you are bringing back people and what you should be doing as your safety plan. Over to you, Jen.
Thank you, Tamara. So hopefully everyone has already taken a look at WorkSafe BC's website currently. And if you haven't, and you are either already open or looking at reopening your business, I strongly encourage you to take a look at the website today after we're done here. Right at the top of the website is a header that includes all the information that you need with respect to your obligations, your occupational health and safety obligations to your employees through WorkSafe BC. Now, the different industries are all covered. So I wasn't able for this presentation time-wise to give you a summary of what the different WorkSafe BC obligations are for employers, because they're quite fact-specific to the different industries. The industries are broken down into the different phases. Now that we're in phase 3 in BC, it essentially covers everything. There's also a lot of additional information that you can find on this website that can be helpful. There are FAQs set out with respect to reopening under COVID. There's additional information as well, like the effect on premiums and some changes that have been made in that respect, and reporting deadlines. Now, the main obligation under WorkSafe BC for every employer in the province is that you are obliged to create and have in place a COVID-19 safety plan. This plan should outline the policies and guidelines and procedures that your business has put in place to reduce the risk of COVID-19 transmission. Now, that applies depending on your business, both that's the risk of transmission to your employees and your customers. Again, back to WorkSafe BC's website, if you need some help with that, there's guidelines on the website with respect to how to create the safety plan. There's also a template that you can use for creating the safety plan. Once you have your safety plan in place, you are also obliged to make sure that it's posted and visible in your workplace. Now, you can also request that WorkSafe BC review your safety plan if you have any concerns about whether or not your plan is compliant with your obligations. Now, the one thing I would say about that is be very mindful of the timing. I think WorkSafe BC, like all industries right now, went through a period at least where they were at reduced capacity. And at the same time, their workload was increasing, especially with respect to this. So while you can request a review of your safety plan, chances are it's not going to be very timely. So make sure that you're not waiting for that review before implementing these things, just to protect yourself from any potential liability in that respect. Now, when you are formulating your safety plan, it is a required part of the safety plan that there is communication and input from your employees. This isn't, it needs to be a bit of a two-way street right now. I think generally as well, in your ensuring your obligations for providing a safe workplace for your employees, I cannot stress enough that right now, more than ever, open communication with your employees is key. You need to be considering as well things that you maybe never had to consider with respect to your employees. I think every employer understands they have the obligation to ensure a safe and healthy workplace for their employees. That probably previously primarily centered around the physical well-being of your employees. Right now, though, I think everyone has personal knowledge to some effect of the psychological impact of what's been happening over the last few months. And so you really need to be taking that in consideration as well for your employees. I think, and how that's done is also going to be quite industry specific, because it's going to be relevant to what you're asking your employees to do. It's also going to be specific to the individual and their personal circumstances. And these may be things that you never were aware of before. For instance, you may have employees who are living in multi-generational families, and that was never a concern before, so it was never something that you had to take into consideration. But these are things that you do have to take into consideration now. And the best way to do that is to make sure that your employees know as well that this is an ongoing two-way street in terms of communication, that at any time with any concerns, they can come to you, and that you will do the same with them. Now, related to the changes that have been made with respect to the COVID leaves, employers also now have a statutory right to refuse an employee's request to return to work. Now, that is only applicable if there are specific safety concerns about the employee's potential exposure to COVID-19 and how that relates to their potentially exposing other employees. This is there, and it's a statutory right. I would, though, stress that you need to proceed very cautiously with this. There is statements out there from different government authorities that COVID-19 will likely be treated as a disability. When you're treating your employees, you should be taking that into consideration. There are obligations to accommodate employees with disabilities. An employee who has had COVID-19 should be given the same type of considerations. I mean, they're not the same considerations, but the same thought should be put into it to ensure that you're not unnecessarily, putting restrictions, etc., on them. This is a place where I think if you think that this is going to be a problem, I would really strongly encourage you to get legal advice before you take action. Now, related to that, if you know that an employee has tested positive for COVID-19, now normally with privacy legislation and obligations on employers, you can't share personal medical information of an employee to other employees. However, under COVID-19, the other employees have a certain right to know a certain level of information. I would not recommend at any step that you immediately go and tell other employees that they may have been exposed, or that you provide any information of where that exposure may come through. I think your first call, once you've been notified that an employee has tested positive, is to the public health office. They can provide you with direction with respect to how you inform your other employees and the next steps that you take. If you do that, you shouldn't have any concerns with any potential breaches of privacy, because then you fulfilled your obligations and you can say, I took direction directly from the government as with respect to what to do and how to do it. And I think you're going to protect yourself there. Now, you should also be contacting WorkSafe BC. Your first call, though, should be to the public health office and then to WorkSafe BC, and they can also assist you with maybe there's changes that need to be made to your safety plan because of this. So that brings us to the next topic, and I am going to hand it back over to you, Tamara.
Thanks, Jen. So once you have your safety plan in place, you have to consider some of the legal obligations and some of the considerations and risks that are associated with bringing the employees back. For instance, once someone has taken a COVID-19 leave and they're coming back to the workplace, they're entitled to their same job or same or similar employment in the same or comparable position. And what's interesting, and employers really need to make note of this, is if the employee is off on a COVID-19 leave, they are entitled to take this leave for as long as they continue to meet the eligible criteria. And so this is another stage that Jen was talking about, open and honest communication. And in some aspects, you are going to have to seek legal advice because the duration of this pandemic and how it's impacting the workplace is still an unknown. Other issues we talked about, and we're basing this on the primarily the main questions we're getting from people. What about the childcare responsibilities? What about high-risk employees? As Jen mentioned, employers do have a statutory right now to refuse a request to return to work. And under this COVID-19 leave, you always have a need for medical information, but there's also privacy aspects. This one doesn't necessarily let you require a medical note. I will note that there is a new leave that was brought in recently. It's called the illness and injury leave. It also gives employees 3 days annually to take time off. It does not have to be related to COVID, but you have to be aware that this is now an additional time off that employees can take. So what are the risks if you fail to bring back the employees in time, or you don't file this extension for the temporary layoff provisions and things like that? You could be exposed to having employees state that, well, I was dismissed. I was temporarily laid off. They didn't bring me back in the time, and to be honest, I should never have been laid off. So what is constructive dismissal? So constructive dismissal is a substantial change in the terms and conditions of the employment, even though the employee wasn't expressly terminated. So how does this work? As I mentioned previously, under the Employment Standards Act, it gives you some information about the extension and the duration of this leave, but it doesn't necessarily give you the right to lay off employees. And this is a tricky situation for employees and employers. So when is a temporary layoff permitted? It's allowed under a collective bargaining agreement. So that is any employees or any situations where you have union workers under collective bargaining agreement. Number 2, was it expressly provided for in the employment agreement? Before COVID, it wasn't that common to have a temporary layoff provision. You might not have employees agreeing to that. It was fairly common in some other industries, as you'll see in paragraph 3, if the layoff is implied by well-known industry practice. I'm looking at seasonal work or logging industries, things of that nature. And then the 4th aspect is whether the employee actually agreed to the layoff. In many situations, employees have agreed to the layoff, but in many situations, employers haven't obtained that consent, and it's not addressed in their employment agreement. And so there is exposure to a potential constructive dismissal claim. Again, layoff may constitute a termination of employment in the absence of any of those conditions that were listed on the prior page. Again, and the burden of proof is on the employer. So you have to show that you do meet some of those provisions. Again, I want to emphasize that the courts and everyone is looking at this situation, this pandemic, because it's a unique situation, and there may be frustration of contract elements. There may be situations where the layoff was permitted, but you have to recognize that there is exposure, and I would highly recommend that you obtain the consent of your employees prior to the layoff period, or modify your policies and procedures due to this pandemic, and ensure that employment agreements moving forward permit this type of layoff. Now, the next situation is if they refuse to come back to work, and I'll let Jen just walk you through some of those situations.
Thank you, Tamara. In order to keep us on time, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but we'll be available for questions at the end. So a question that we've also been getting a lot is what to do if an employee refuses to return to work. I think as an employer right now, you do have an obligation to dig into that a little bit further. You should be finding out to the extent that you can, asking the employee why they don't want to return to work. They may refuse to provide you with that information, but I think as an employer, if you make the effort to find that out and determine whether or not there are any accommodations that maybe weren't in place before that could facilitate that return, I think you have an obligation to do so. You should also be looking then, once you have that information, are there any of those new COVID-19 related leaves that are available for that employee? Now, if all of that is done, assuming that as an employer you're meeting all of your obligations and the employee is still refusing to return, fear or discomfort alone does not give a worker outright right to refuse to return to work. So in that case, if everything else is made, it's possible that the employee is either effectively quitting. It's also possible, and I've included a quote here from the Employment Standards Branch, that the contract itself, the agreement of employment, has been frustrated. Now, this quote that's here, this was released by the Employment Standards Branch, saying basically that it's possible that if an employer or an employee terminates for any reasons that are not directly pardon me, I'm reading the wrong part, but it's possible frustration of the contract. The one thing I do want to say, though, is, again, you need to proceed with caution. The Employment Standards Branch is not actually, this is just their thoughts on this. Basically, this isn't a binding decision on any authority if there wasn't a complaint that was made. This will not necessarily be the final say on how this goes. So I think if you're faced with an employee who's refusing to return after you've done everything, you really need to, again, probably contact someone and get some advice before taking the step of saying the employment contract is frustrated, you're no longer our employee. Finally, for employees that are going to continue to work, but continue to work from home, you want to take into consideration some additional things that you maybe hadn't originally. I think at the beginning of this, it was a bit of an emergency situation and everybody understood that. So things were put together on really short notice. But as Tamara has already outlined, when you change an employee's terms of their contract or their employment agreement, you're potentially constructively dismissing them. The longer that employee is in that situation right now, I think the more likely it is for it to be constructive dismissal. So if you have employees who are not returning, but are going to be working from home potentially indefinitely at the moment, you probably need to right now be looking again at what the circumstances of them working from home are. In addition to that, there's privacy obligations that need to be considered. Again, I think probably more leeway would be given at the beginning. The longer this goes on, the less likely that is. So I've included here a list of different privacy aspects that should be considered. At the end of the day, these privacy obligations, depending on your industry, may make it so that the employee simply can't return or can't continue to work from home. And so you may be forced or in a position where you need to look at either returning that employee to the workplace or looking at terminating their employment. I think we are now out of time for our portion of this presentation. So now I'm going to hand it over to Dan, who's going to pick up with the next topic.
Thanks a lot, Jen. Yeah, so we'll shift gears here a little bit, and the nice part about this is that you'll see some commonalities between the two because they go hand in hand from the HR side. So as we're going through, and myself and my colleague AJ will be working through this, we will go through and present on these different areas here. So, for AJ and myself, like Chris had mentioned, we focus our time in human resources. I mean, that's our background. And in taking a look at that, especially as Jen was saying, this was emergent right off the get-go. I mean, it was mid-March of a switch was flicked and either businesses closed down or everybody in your organization shifted to working from home, right? And if I go back to then, it was, it'll be 2 to 6 weeks. And now we're like, okay, are we talking months, years? What is this, right? So now that folks have had time to be in this space, although uncomfortable, it's okay, from a longer term perspective, what does this look like? So we will go through and just talk about, what you can think of with the structure of your business, tips and tricks for managing performance remotely, promoting productivity and, engagement remotely with folks. And then finally going through and talking about that hiring and onboarding. There were a number of questions there. So the first piece we wanted to tackle was going through, and this might sound counterintuitive at this moment, but now that we've been in this for a bit, if you have reopened, about to reopen, your employees are working from home, from an HR standpoint, if you haven't done so, and from a business standpoint, again, it'll sound counterintuitive. I want you to push pause a little bit, because we get questions and work through with our clients. Well, what do we need to do in the short, intermediate and long term with this? Well, if you've gone through and done your due diligence and say reviewing your business functions, what functions can happen from home, which ones do we need, for a storefront? We need folks in the office. What does that look like? A good place is to review your business functions. The resources you have, put in your contingency plans. So assuming you've done that, the next piece we talk about and work through from an assessment standpoint is, okay, well, let's define our roles. Have some roles changed? Have we created new roles? As was mentioned, you need to be very mindful because you do not want to go down the constructive dismissal route. That I'm glad we have LK Law here on presenting with us, because that's typically our caveat. We're not lawyers, and for any changes to employment, we suggest you reach out to your employment lawyer. But going through and taking a look at those pieces there, how have we reorganized the business if we need to go through so we can have long-term sustainability, right? Maybe we're not the size that we used to be. Maybe we've switched up our operations. Have we defined those job descriptions? Have we put those roles in? Has there been impacts to pay? Folks are still hiring. What does that look like? And then from within there, we get a lot of questions around, from a compensation standpoint, what does this mean? Well, early days for that at this point. There are folks going through and taking a look at it. I read a lot of articles out there. If you're shifting to working from home, you might see pay being shifted or reduced, whatever that might be. We're not seeing that yet. I think it's too early to go through from that standpoint. But again, this is very individualized for your business. So going through, getting the research, getting the credible data will help you navigate this, because you want to be making decisions with market-driven data. And then recalling employees from leave. Well, we just covered that section there with LK Law. So I'll leave that piece there. So as we shift to supporting employees remotely, and if you think of those pillars I talked about before, a few things you want to do here, and these were touched on a little bit earlier. So we shifted folks to working from home. I'm one of those employees, but at our firm, majority of folks, March 17th, whatever it was, boom, we're at home. I've been in the same workspace. I'm fortunate that I have a room I can close the door and go through and take a look at that. But if I look at my workspace, it's been 4 months. I mean, currently I'm at a kitchen table with a book under my laptop to raise it, right? And my guess is some of you are like that, and some of your employees, or the majority, are working from that situation as well, right? So now that it's been 4 months, and if you're thinking from a remote standpoint, this may be a longer term scenario. For example, a global 500 company, Simmons, their CEO recently announced, well, you know what, the work from home, it's going to be extended through to the end of 2021, right? And that's significant. Because if we think of that from an employee standpoint, well, what do we need to do to ensure they're effective? So, we have a wheel here that you can take a look at. Have we encouraged dedicated workspaces? That's possible for some, not for others. We need to start taking a little bit more of an individualized approach as we start working through this. have we promoted proper ergonomics? So you're hearing WorkSafe BC be referenced quite a bit. They have fantastic resources in there to take a look at that. So as we go through and take a look at these pieces, it is very important for us to make sure that we're setting up the right environment, and that environment has extended to at home. Childcare and elder care, I mean, that was touched on before as well, but have we put in, permanent or temporary policies to help with our hours of work, where we're working, how frequently we're checking in, what those pieces look like? So clients that we're working with, we're seeing for the interim policies being put into place. And then some now are starting to go through and taking a look at this in a more long-term basis. Technology, from that standpoint, if we're asking our employees to work from home, we need to be mindful of how we're setting up their workplace. They might have their laptop and that's it. Well, have we given them keyboards? Are they able to work productively? But we won't go down too far the IT route, but what we're hearing from clients, there's so many collaboration tools out there, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, WebEx, whatever it might be. We have Skype in there. Employees are feeling there's too much collaboration now in the workplace, for example, in terms of the tools that they're using. So being mindful there. And then finally, as we go through and take a look, before I pass it on to AJ here, the increase of performance feedback and coaching, AJ will get into, but there's a mental health piece to this as well that was alluded to earlier, and the physical or the psychological impacts of working from home. Sometimes it can feel like Groundhog Day. So if we checked in with our employees more so than how are your work outputs coming? So you can still build your culture and you can still be mindful of how you do that. So with our clients and walking them through this is, well, what are your values, right? Your vision is likely still the same. Which values are you trying to promote? And you can do that remotely. We just need to be a little bit more creative. So for a learning culture, well, there's no reason we can't get on calls like this. And there's webinar, as you folks know, there's so many webinars out there, but a nice tactic and to build community, well, to get folks internally presenting to each other on what they're learning and what they're saying, right? So if that's one of our values, that's a way we can go through and still do that without overburdening our workforce. So there's all these pieces you can go through and take a look at, and there's HR assessment that you can run through it and help from this standpoint. But again, it's pushing pause and making time to do it, because you probably feel, folks I've talked to anyway, a little lost. What are the next steps? Things are so uncertain. How do we go about this? So with that, I'll flip it over to you, AJ, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, no, terrific. Thanks a lot, Dan, and thanks to LK. That was fantastic information. And to really, continue this conversation, as all of us know, COVID-19 is really fast forward us into the future of work, and whether it's temporary or whether it's a permanent strategy for your organization going forward, as employers, we really need to make sure that we have the right foundational pieces to take care of our employees. And we've seen these last few months since March really change the way both employees look at their priorities and what's important to them, and really how organizations have adapted to effectively manage these individuals. And so when we look here at promoting this productivity and engagement, really, as Dan's last slide mentioned, the underlying and the major factor in that first building block is to ensure that our organizations are operating with transparency and trust. And so with that, it's really vital to creating an engaged and productive work environment. And we know it's a really new journey for all of us, and we're not going to have all the answers, but it's about keeping that open dialogue and transparency. And that's really what's going to build the trust, which is foundation for collaboration, productivity, and engagement. And we've talked to a lot of our clients, and we've seen a huge issue there is how this remote work has drastically changed the way that employees interact with the rest of their team and with the rest of their managers. And the way to find success through that is is building an environment of trust, because as leaders or managers or owners of the business, we just don't have that luxury anymore of coming into our office and seeing our teams working at their desks from 8 to 4, or poking our head in an office just to see how a report is coming along. So we're kind of in the dark in that sense, and it's unfamiliar territory. So we really need to ensure that we have the trust that things are getting done, but we also don't want to have blind trust. We want to ensure that we have the right processes in place to ensure productivity and effectiveness, and that we've put some safeguards to avoid any negative situations. And so, how do we create this trust? And it doesn't happen overnight, and it's not an easy change. And I know we were kind of thrown into this environment a few months ago, but really it's about taking a step back and creating constant communication with our team, both as a group and individually. It's about setting those clear expectations. And then it's about bringing the team together with a common vision and purpose that will create alignment so that everyone's moving forward towards the same organizational direction. And so when we look at, the first bullet here, the defining goals, expectations, and setting priorities, it's not a blanket approach. There's, no one size fits all to any organization or specific role. It's really going to be individualized to each person. So we don't want to assume that people understand what's expected of them, especially as these times have really created a drastic change in our work environment, in people's roles and responsibilities. So we need to engage in some meaningful dialogue with management and employees to identify what the expectations are and what the goals are, and whether that's taking a new look at roles and responsibilities and job descriptions, and are those up to date and current and reflecting your environment now? But really it's then sitting down with the employees and setting those expectations and priorities. And with remote teams, we've seen one of the bigger issues is that communication is more challenging. Things are getting lost in translation. So it's important to be crystal clear about our duties, responsibilities, and setting those priorities so that everybody knows really what the timelines are, what's expected of them, where are their priorities, so we can avoid any situations and setbacks, and we're able to hold people accountable to a much higher degree. And so, those aren't just constant check-ins or one-time check-ins. You've checked the box, you had a conversation. It's ongoing, it's continual. So we always want to make sure that we're having those conversations. And another big thing that we've seen increase a lot of productivity and engagement, we worked with some of our clients in terms of shifting the mindset from our typical 8 to 4 and really managing outcomes and outputs rather than inputs. And this is generally a good approach to people management. You look at the results-oriented work environment or some sort of hybrid approach to that, where we're focusing more on task and goal-driven objectives and allowing employees to manage more of their time effectively and being accountable for the work being delivered in a timely manner and quality of work. Because we know everybody's got some different situations, as we mentioned, childcare, elder care. We don't know what their setup's like. So it's no longer about that 8 to 4 in some capacity. I know we can't always get away from it, but it's about the results and what they're producing and what those expectations are. And so really importantly is taking a step back and defining what that looks like. And then, communication and collaboration, another huge aspect and probably where we've dropped off the most and where we've seen the biggest dip. Remote teams can feel disconnected. And so our managers need to ensure that they make themselves available and that they're proactive in connecting with their team and helping them overcome any challenge. And so it, whether it's just one-on-ones and checking in, how you doing, what's your workload look like, are you feeling engaged? We've worked with clients in terms of initiating some surveys to gauge how employees are feeling and how engaged they are, but having a good conversation with them so that we can really allow them to feel heard and more connected to the organization. And that goes a long way. And there's tons of tools and technology, as Dan mentioned, but communication is just so critical right now. So don't worry about overdoing it, because your team might be cut off from those more familiar and organic information flows that they would typically get from the office. So as leaders, we really need to make time to drive new channels of communication and cascade information effectively. And same with collaboration, another aspect we're really missing, and you could probably put some creativity in there as well. This is promoted by management, driven by the employees, but we want to ensure that our people are working collaboratively and still feeling as though they're part of a team and working towards those organizational goals. So wherever it's possible, task force works, multiple people working on different projects, that's going to increase productivity, going to increase engagement, going to allow people to hold each other accountable and really feel as though they still have that team culture and team-driven mindset. And so the bottom line there is just building the trust, setting expectations, and having these continual conversations and feedback. So, super simple solutions, but really a lot of the time they're overlooked and they're not executed effectively. And so it's never too late to just take a step back and reevaluate there. And so I'm going to be respectful of time. I know we're kind of pushing it here. I want to make sure we can get into the Q&As because I've seen a lot of great questions come in. So I just want to briefly touch on, what the market looks like in terms of hiring and onboarding. But again, our contact information will be shown near the end, and myself or Dan, as well as the LK group, more than happy to have any conversations, especially in this area, as I'm not going to dive too deep into it. But the hiring market, we know that in March, everything took a huge halt and organizations took a step back and just wanted to see how things have unfolded. And surprisingly now, as we've gone through it, we've been here for a couple months, we're now seeing a pretty robust market on the hiring side. And many organizations are now starting to make decisions and move forward in terms of bringing in new people or just readjusting their organizations or accounting for turnover. And so on the candidate side, we're really seeing individuals being much easier to reach and way more open to having conversations and considering options, which gives us the ability with our clients to really sell those organizations and, some of the golden nuggets why people want to work for you. And so because candidates have really taken this time to self-evaluate, self-reflect, see what's important to them, and they might want to, continue with the remote, or maybe they don't want the remote, but we've definitely seen that change, and it's quite a market because previously unemployment rate in BC was about 4%. We were among the lowest in Canada. And as of June, I believe it's about 13%. So we've definitely seen the effects from people leaning out and terminations, layoffs. We've seen that come in, but now organizations are getting a lot more comfortable. And so the first thing at real high level here is what organizations need to do for both their recruitment and onboarding is take a step back and look at your end-to-end process for both of those areas and really ensure that we've got the right standardization, it reflects our current market, and it's up to date and current. And so, we know that from a hiring perspective, we want to ensure that our jobs have been defined properly and job descriptions are up to date and reflect our current market. And we also want to rely more on a standardized process because there's no handshake and gut feeling in terms of making a hiring decision. We want to set our hiring managers up for success so they're bringing in the right people. And that they're also creating a really exceptional candidate experience. And, a lot of candidates are going through the tough job hunt, and we all know what that's like. And so we want to make sure we're communicating with them really effectively. And where we've relied a lot more heavily on is virtual interviews and setting up, more virtual meetings with candidates, but also relying heavier on reference checks. When we go to the market, we'll typically do 3 to 4 reference checks with candidates and employers, whether it's previous supervisors or managers, and then maybe a colleague, really to just get a well-rounded look so that we can feel confident in who we're bringing in. And then, moving on to onboarding, it's vitally important because there's tons of statistics that show a really proper and efficient onboarding experience shoots up the numbers for productivity, engagement, retention, and longevity. It's incredible, the stats showing that those affected. So, we want to, again, reevaluate what those look like and put kind of a human touch on them, right? We want to ensure, as Dad said, they've got the right technology, they've got the proper setup, whether it's at home or in the office, so that they can be successful from day one. We also want to ensure that we can let our culture shine a little bit through. So maybe sending them a care package before with office supplies, some company swag, anything that can really allow your culture to shine through. And, if they're working remotely, don't have them feel isolated. Stretch out that onboarding process. Maybe schedule some virtual one-on-ones with people they're working with, or people that are in a different department, so they can get a feel for the culture, because they're not going to be able to step into an office and see a bunch of faces and have conversations in the lunchroom. So we almost want to recreate that with little 1v1s or group sessions to just make them feel part of a team. And we also want to make sure we look at our policies and handbooks and whatever paperwork's needed, and digitalize it and send it to them beforehand. So really it's about taking a step back for both of those and making sure that, we're including everybody. We're having an efficient and standardized process from start to finish, whether it's job descriptions all the way to 6 months in that onboarding, and having continual conversations. And so now is really the time to build these deeper connections with both the individuals within our organization, but also those who are interested in our organization. And so again, if anybody has more questions and wants to dive a little bit deeper into those areas, I'm happy to do so. I'm just going to be cognizant of time so that we can get to some of these Q&As. So Chris, I will pass it over to you now, because I think you just muted. There we are.
I'm learning. That Dan and AJ, Tamara and Jennifer, that's good stuff. Especially AJ and Dan. I think sometimes when you go and see your lawyer, you forget that we're actually business owners as well. So all the issues that are touched upon and how quickly everything changed in March. I have the same concerns as a partner here. How do I keep my employees employed? How do I keep them engaged? And so what I've tried to do is communicate. And even if I don't have answers, is communicate with my support staff and my associates that, look, we're all kind of going through this together. And this is once in a generational event, we hope. And so that is what I do. We have a number of very good questions. And I think this is Raina Liu has asked a question I think Dan and AJ should address, and you have addressed in your presentations. But the direct question is, we have some employees who are in the office and some employees who are not. How do we keep everyone inspired and connected?
Yeah, it's a great question. That's the challenge, right? And, as you said, Chris, this is new to everybody. And you don't always have to have the right answer right away. It's kind of about addressing these things early. And as we go back to it's about communication. It's about transparency and building the trust. And we're in a new realm here, but really to keep everyone inspired and connected, whether they're in the office or not, you really need to have a solid baseline. You don't want to treat the remote people differently than you would the people in the office. You need a constant communication stream so that everybody's feeling part of the team. And I think a big thing of the engagement is just the communication, the constant check-ins, and ensuring that we're addressing their needs.
Yeah, and the last piece there, you need to be focused on it, right? I mean, if you had an office environment before where you got together as a group, you still need to promote that in one way, shape, or form. And if you're the business owner, you can facilitate some of that, but you can get your employees to drive that too, because they'll have a good understanding of what works for them.
Right. That's something we're trying to do all the time, is engage each other and make sure there. I am so sorry. I just slaughtered people's names, but here we go. Aiden Nessblack has asked a question about, we are completely remote and only myself and other primaries ever go to the office. Are we still in need of a safety plan outside of on-site work? So I take it this is a question for Jennifer and Tamara, that there's only a few of the actual workforce attending the work site. Does a safety plan need to be used?
I would say yes. The obligation is still there to have a safety plan, but your safety plan luckily should be pretty straightforward and easy. But in terms of, again, protecting yourself from potential liability in that respect, whether it's from, your employees making a complaint or directly from WorkSafe BC, I really think that you're probably best off, to any extent that you can, meeting your obligations in that regard. And I just wanted to point out, because I know that there was a question that came in earlier about where to find the information on the safety plan. And so when you go on to WorkSafe BC's website, there's going to be a banner right across the page. Unfortunately, it looks quite a bit like an ad, and you can collapse it. So if you do that automatically, you're going to have a really hard time with the information. If you do that, though, there's still going to be an orange thin line across the top that you can expand back out. In that banner, there's different. You want to go down to the resources heading. It's in bold, it's in black. There is where you're going to find the guidelines for preparing the safety plan, and that is where you're also going to find the template.
All right. There's also there's a question here. I'm going to kind of reshape it. I think it's anybody who wants to jump in. It's a legal and sort of organizational issue. But Ken Howie says that we work with vulnerable clients. So I take it clients coming in, they're at COVID risk. And his question is, what expectations can we set on employees? I think it's management direction to minimize the risk of infection. I would take it there, whether it was PPE gear or certain requirements of your employees that he's wondering about.
Yeah, and I have a comment on that. There's the recommended safety guides and health guides and procedures you should be following by, the government of Canada and BC. So beyond that, the biggest things are, do your folks have the proper PPE? Can they practice, social distancing? Or if they can't, are you taking the proper precautions as outlined by the recommended guidelines? So becoming very familiar with those are the largest pieces to do. And if, individuals have specific concerns, yes, try to speak to those and address them. But the recommended safety guidelines for having close interactions are quite detailed. So we found, employers working through that and just being very aware and cognizant of, what those interactions are. It seems to be doing the trick.
Muting myself. Sorry, I keep muting myself so I hear the good answers. Larry Jung has a question. I think that's for the employment lawyers here. Are employees on COVID leave of absence still entitled to access employee benefits such as medical and extended health?
Hi, that's a very good question. And so, I mean, when someone's on a leave of absence, even though this is called a COVID-19 leave of absence, you're going to treat it like as you would with any other leave of absence. And that's a situation where you have to evaluate moving forward. Those benefits and things should be continued. Again, we're looking at case-by-case basis, but it's similar in the situations when you're handling someone who's off on a maternity leave or parental leave. Again, they're coming back to the same position, but they should also be entitled to some of the benefits that they had while they were employed.
All right. That's the sort of question of why do you have benefits? They're there for your employees when they're sick and the
Right.
like. So my first thought is, given the idea that COVID is a disability, those benefits can't be taken away and shouldn't be taken away. And if they're considered to be taken away, talk to a lawyer or your accountant pretty quickly before you do such a thing.
Very quickly, yes. Thanks, Chris.
Sorry, there's a general. Actually, this is actually a good one for all our professionals, and it goes to the certainty. And quite frankly, we're all sort of swimming in the same stream here. In that, the question from Gabriel Wong is, what do we need to consider when preparing for the second wave? Personally, that's the issue of getting sort of some systems in place. And working through these issues that we have from March onward, using Dan, using AJ, talking to Jennifer and Tamara, and preparing yourself for contingency plans. I know that's what I've been doing. I'm not sure if anybody else can add something on that.
Yeah, that's what we've been mentioning as well. And the contingency plans, not only having, you know, plan A, plan B, but also what's plan C, maybe even plan D from a resourcing standpoint, right? And going through and taking a look at your business and understanding where those break-even points are, where, you know, which resources are absolutely vital to your organization. You've likely gone through this already. Maybe you haven't developed the detailed contingency plans, and if you haven't, you know, we'd suggest get on that sooner rather than later, because the fall, I hate to say this, isn't that far away as I see the sun outside. But for us, that's one of the big pieces there. Just get on top of that planning.
And whether or not a second wave even comes or not, I think COVID was a good reminder that we always constantly have to be taking a step back from our organizations and really reviewing our processes and ensuring they're up to date, right? Everything from, you know, recruitment, onboarding, the legal side of it. It's really important always just to ensure that we have the right processes put in place so that we're never left just wondering or come kind of behind the eight ball. So it's always just a great plan to put all these things in place, put the right processes, and make sure we have some standardization and that our work environment reflects our current marketplace.
I think given this year, disaster planning will be at the forefront of management objectives. I know that it has been for years, but no disaster has arisen. So I know personally we were struggling just the technology aspect of getting everybody out of the workforce at home in March. And so it's always good to have a plan.
Chris, I just wanted to jump in and build on what AJ had said there on this question specifically too. I think back to what we had talked about earlier, that a lot of this was done on a really short time frame and an emergency basis. And I think when you're looking at certain issues of your obligations to your employees and meeting the terms of the employment relationship, that in the short term, there's probably a lot of leeway that was going to be given to both sides when certain things couldn't be met. The longer this goes on, whether it's a second wave or we stay at this level, potentially, I think we've all heard terrible long-term dates. At some point, though, you need to be looking at your human resources policies. If you don't have a policy for working from home, you need to be looking at that. On an emergency basis, I don't think the obligation was there to put one in place. Longer term, there probably is. You know, similarly, if you've changed the way you're providing services, are your human resources policies meeting that? So second phase or not, going forward, that's probably something, the longer this goes on, the more that you want to look into.
You know what we're doing for our second phase, Jen? Trying to get you some childcare.
Yeah, that would be really helpful. Or open borders.
All right, we're at the hour, magic hour, where everybody now decides they need a coffee after listening to all of us go on. It's sunny where I am, so I think it's a good time to end this. I know, speaking for MNP and speaking for Lindsay, Kenney, we appreciate you coming to listen to lawyers and accountants, human resources professionals on a nice summer day. And we hope that if you can take one idea from today and you can contact us, that you look us up. So at that, I'm going to end this this webinar. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much. Thank you.